Hello and welcome. Today I'm doing my follow-up on the Rose Inc products. So if you didn't see my initial first impressions review of the products, I will link that below. But this is my follow-up to that. So I've now had almost a full week to test out these products and gather my more complete thoughts on them. So I'm going to share those with you today. I have the concealer and 3 of the blushes, so I'm going to talk about those. I also now have this lip sculpt, so I'm going to be showing you that and sharing my thoughts on it as well. And I'm going to do some comparisons with the blushes and just talk about how they compare with some of my other favorite cream blush formulas, as well as some shade comparisons. So if you'd like to see all of that, just keep on watching. All right, so I wanted to start out with applying the lip crayon that I got. I think she calls them lip sculpts. So I got the shade Abstraction, which is described as a smoky peach. So that sounded to me like really my kind of color. So that's what the shade looks like swatched, and I'm gonna put it on my lips so we can see how it actually looks on the face. So there it is on the lips. I think it's a beautiful color. It's an everyday kind of color. For me, it's not a My Lips But Better kind of color. It doesn't look good when I don't have makeup on or when I have very, very minimal makeup on. It's just a little bit too toned down. I think there's probably a little bit too much gray or cool tones in there for me to be able to wear it like that. But with other makeup on, I think it looks really nice. It's a nice tone for if you want to wear a more nude lip or a more neutral lip in the autumn. I think it's really nice because it has a bit of that sort of brown, a little bit more grungy kind of feel to it. It is described as a smoky peach, and I think that that's a good description for it. It's just a little bit more earthy and toned down than a lot of other peaches are. You can see that the finish is quite matte. It's not a flat matte, but it is matte. Feels comfortable on the lips. I would say it feels pretty similar to something like the Charlotte Tilbury mattes. It's a little bit like that, a little bit almost like the Bite Beauty mattes. It's kind of a standard feeling matte that's quite thin, so it's very nice. It wears pretty well. I don't think this color in particular, I can't tell if it really stains my lips or not. So I find that when I eat or drink, it does rub off and doesn't leave much color behind. More, brightly pigmented or more deeply pigmented colors may leave a little bit of a stain, but I just can't tell with this color because it's kind of close to my lip color. So it does seem to just sort of wear off when I eat or when I drink, and I don't find it has a particularly long wear time or a particularly short wear time. Again, it's kind of like the Charlotte Tilbury mattes in my opinion in that way, in that it just sort of wears down nice and naturally and isn't extremely long lasting, but isn't extremely short lasting either. I'd say it's sort of mid-range in terms of the wear time. It feels very comfortable for a matte. Again, it feels quite lightweight and it doesn't feel drying on the lips. There was really just one comparison I wanted to do with it. So this is Abstraction and this is Lisa Eldridge's Velvet Fawn, because these have sort of similar feels in terms of the types of colors that they are. But if you look at the comparison, you can see that there is a difference there. Abstraction is more peach and warm toned, whereas Fawn has a little bit more, more brown even, I would say, and it's a little bit more pinky and almost gray, a little bit more cool toned than Abstraction. So that's Abstraction from Rose Inc, and that's Lisa Eldridge's Velvet Fawn. And now I want to get into the updates of the products that I already showed in my previous video. So just starting with the concealer, I realized that the texture of this concealer and the finish of it reminded me most of my Kosas Revealer Concealer. And I wanted to actually just swatch the two just so you can see. While the finish and texture are somewhat similar, the Rose Inc I find to still be a lot creamier and a lot higher coverage than the Kosas. A very little bit of the Rose Inc concealer goes quite a long way, whereas the Kosas is just more sort of standard. It even kind of helps, I find, for the Kosas to dry down a little bit before I blend it out so I can get the level of coverage that I want from it. So this one here is the Rose Inc and that's the Kosas. And you can kind of see they have that similar dewy sort of moisturized finish to them. I also realized that the Rose Ink Concealer is almost a little bit gray looking, but it seems to blend out really nicely on the skin. And I would say if you have very fair skin and you don't want to go to a really like pinky cool toned or a really yellowy warm toned kind of shade, you would be fine with this one because it's supposed to be a neutral undertone. And though it does look a little bit gray when it's really thick like that and when it's in the bottle, it blends out nicely on the skin and actually does a pretty good job of neutralizing the kind of red and pink tones in the skin. I've been wearing the concealer, I think, every day since I first got it, and I've really been enjoying it. I love that sort of dewy finish combined with the higher level of coverage. I think it's a really nice combination, and it wears really well too. It lasts all day. I find that if I do a little bit of powder, I like to use I've been using my Kosas powder with it, the Cloud Set. And if I set it down just really lightly with that, it lasts really well all day. And it lasts really well without powder as well, although it may wear off a little bit faster, maybe around the 5-6 hour mark. You might want to touch it up. You may see a little bit of fading, particularly for me, like around the nose. But I think it wears really nicely and it's a beautiful formula. So I'm really happy to have that concealer. All right, so now to the blushes. I wanted to do some comparisons with other formulas as well as some shades. So I think I'll start with just talking about the formula. And I realized that the formula of these blushes reminds me most of the Tower 28 blushes. I have two shades of the Tower 28s, and actually they do kind of align with two of the shades of the Rose Ink blushes that I have. So I'm curious to compare those to each other. But just in terms of the formula and the feel of them, I think it is quite similar. They're both more sort of sticky textures, and I don't mean that things stick to them, but I just mean like the feeling when you swatch them. It's a more tacky feeling. It doesn't like glide like some cream blushes, like I'm going to be talking about the Westman Atelier ones as well, and they really have a real gliding kind of texture, whereas these are a more tacky kind of texture. Both types of formulas blend out really well, and I like how each of them looks on the skin, but I would say that these are more along the lines of the Tower 28 formula than the Westman Atelier formula. Also, just to mention the Salt New York blushes, those are probably my favorite cream blushes, and I would consider the Salt in terms of their texture to be sort of in between the Westman Atelier and the Tower 28 and Rose Ink side of things, because they're not tacky, but they're a little bit more dewy than the Westman Atelier, but they still somehow have that beautiful glide to them. And they're more on the thin side in terms of their formula, kind of like the Westman Atelier, whereas I feel that the Tower 28s and the Rose Inks are just a little bit of a thicker formula as well. For shade comparisons, I wanted to take Heliotrope. And Heliotrope is certainly going to be my most worn of these Rose Ink shades. I just know that because it's a neutral and it's a lighter color, it's just going to be more of a go-to for me. This is Westman Atelier Chouchette right next to it. And then I wanted to do Tower 28 Magic Hour. And I wanted to throw in Salt New York's Rose, although I think that Rose is quite a bit cooler toned than the rest of these colors. All right, so here are the four swatches. This is Rose Ink Heliotrope. That's Westman Atelier Chouchette. Then we have Tower 28's Magic Hour and Salt New York's Rose. So I do think that Rose is more cool toned and has more pink in it than the rest of these colors, but they're definitely all in the same family. They're all kind of rosy, peachy, toned down nude blush colors. The Tower 28, I'm seeing it swatched here, and it does look to be even dewier than the Rose Ink ones. So although they're a similar texture and formula, I feel the Tower 28 is even more dewy looking on the skin. And the Westman Atelier is a more sort of matte, and you probably saw even when I was swatching it there how beautifully it really just glides on and has a very thin texture to it. I would say that these three here are all pretty much the same shade. They're going to show up pretty similar on the skin in terms of their shades. So once again, that's Rose Ink Heliotrope, that is Westman Atelier Chouchette, Tower 28 Magic Hour, and Salt New York Rose. I should mention I am wearing the concealer today and over foundation, and I'm also wearing the blushes. I have Heliotrope all over the cheeks as my main blush color, and then I topped it off with Ophelia today. This is the more pink one. I have Ophelia and Anemone, and I used the more pinky one today to just sort of amplify the blush on the apples of my cheeks. And I really like how both of these brighter, sort of deeper colors pair with Heliotrope. I think that's probably my favorite way of wearing these blushes, is to have that base down of the lighter, more neutral color, and then just top it off with a more bright and vibrant color for a really nice flush on the cheeks. So I wanted to now get into comparisons for Anemone, which is the more coral shade. All right, so this is Anemone from Rose Inc. In the middle, I have Golden Hour from Tower 28. And then on this side here is the shade Coral from Salt New York. So I think that the Salt New York and the Rose Inc are pretty similar shades. The middle one here, the Tower 28, to me is a lot more orange than these other two tones. But in the end, when you blend them out on your cheeks, they're probably going to end up giving a pretty similar sort of corally flush, but I just want to note that little bit of a difference, that the Tower 28 is quite a bit more orangey when swatched than these other two shades here. So once again, this is Anemone from Rose Inc. This is Golden Hour from Tower 28, and this is Coral from Salt New York. All right, and last but not least, we have Ophelia here. This is Ophelia, and I've compared it here to Salt New York's Peach, which looks like this. And this is the Natasha Denona Daria Cream Blush. This one right here. I should just mention the texture of the Daria Cream Blush is much more of a dry cream blush feeling than the Rose Inc, which, as I have talked about, is a more tacky kind of wet feeling texture. And looking at the shades here, I think that the Salt New York Peach, it's a pinky peach, but it's much more peach than Ophelia is, which is more of a true pink as it's described. And when I compare Daria to Ophelia, I think that Ophelia again is more pink. I can see more of the sort of purpley blue undertones in there, although it does have peachiness in it too, but I can see a lot more of that sort of purpley undertone mixed into the Ophelia than I see in Daria, which to me is much more of, it's kind of a warm pink rather than a true pink, I suppose. So once again, this is Ophelia from Rose Inc. Then we have Salt New York's Peach, and this is Daria Cream Blush from Natasha Denona. Just regarding the wear time of these cream blushes from Rose Inc., I would say they're comparable to the Tower 28s and even the Westman Atelier in how well they wear. They last quite well, but they could use a touch-up sort of around the, again, the 5 or 6 hour mark. So maybe if you were touching up your concealer, you'd want to touch up the blush at the same time. But they wear really nicely. They just sort of, like most cream blushes, they just sort of sink into the skin as the day goes on, and you lose a bit of that color. Oh, and I think I may have gotten a question about how the blushes compare to the Lisa Eldridge blushes. The texture is very different. The Lisa Eldridge ones are kind of like a dry, moussey feeling, so that's very different from the more tacky feeling of these ones. And I didn't pull out my Lisa Eldridge blushes for shade comparisons, but what I'll do is I'll just do a couple of posts on my community board. So if you're curious to see shade comparisons between the Rose Inc blushes and the Lisa Eldridge ones, just go to my community tab and you'll be able to see those, if not now, within the next day or so. All right, so I think that's it for this video. Thanks so much for watching. Let me know below if you have any questions or comments, and if you'd like to see more from me and you haven't subscribed to my channel already, I'd really love for you to do so. Thanks again so much. Take care, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye.